Hello, my name is John Dillon, and we are here to talk about Apex programming. We are doing a three-part series on collections, and today's topic is going to be lists, or the list object. And before we get started, let's just do a quick overview of collections themselves. There are three primary collections that we're going to be covering in this series: lists, sets, and maps. And the reason we use them, and these are used all through computer science, and just about any programming language or programming environment will have these concepts. We're often working with collections of things. Often when we're writing software, we're not just dealing with one item at a time, whether it's a game and you're talking about players or objects on the screen, or in this case with Salesforce, you might be working with opportunities or contacts or accounts. Very often we're dealing with more than one at a time. And even if we're dealing with one item, let's say one account will have multiple opportunities. We always need to work with things that are in collections or groups of items. So that's where the collections classes come in. And the collections classes allow us to do very common activities on groups of objects, and we'll dig into the details of what that means right now. Let's look at some code, and we will do some examples of lists and things you can do with lists. So for this video, we're going to be working in anonymous Apex because it's not necessary to jump into a class structure or anything like that. So when would we need to use a list, or what does a list do? A list is, like it sounds, similar to a shopping list. It's something you might have a group of items in a particular order. So if I've got, let's say, the colors red, green, and yellow, I might want to store those on a list in order. Let's take a look at what that would look like. So our list of colors, we can see, let's just break down what some of these pieces are here. So here is where we're declaring a list. And with collections in Salesforce, in Apex, you need to specify what type of thing you are holding. In this case, we're going to be holding strings. And you give it a name. Our variable is called colors. And we invoke it using its constructor, new list. Again, we specify that it's a list of strings, and open and close parentheses. To add to our list, there's a method on the list object called add. And we can do this continually, and that's how you build up your list. At this point, we have a list of colors. Once we have our list created, and in this case populated with some data, there are various things we can do with it. To see a complete list of all the things you can do with a list, we can look at the documentation. The Apex reference guide is always a great place to look to see what a particular object or class does. We can see the constructors. We can create an empty one like we did in our example. We can create one that's a copy of another list. And you can also copy it from sets, which we will talk about sets in the next video. Now, there are plenty of methods to go over. We are not going to hit them all in this video. That would take way too long. But you can see there are things we can do to clear the list. We can make a copy of it using clone. We can look to see if it contains an element. Probably the most used item is this get. This is how we grab things out of the list. You can also remove things. Again, too many to go through, but we'll hit a couple. We'll also take a look at size. It's often important to check the size of a list. In our example here, what we can do is check the size at the beginning, and we can check the size at the end. Let's take a look at what we get here. So when we first started, we had 0, and when we're done, we had 3, exactly what we expected. We're next going to look at how to index items. An important aspect of a list is things in a list are kept in order. For instance, item 0 we would expect to be red, item 1 to be green, and item 2 to be yellow. Now our size is 3, but because we start counting from 0, the last element of a list is always going to be 1 less than the size. Red, green, and yellow, and they're in the same order that we looked at prior. One other thing we can do with a list is we can sort it, and then we can print out the items again in order and see what we get. Green, red, yellow. So obviously it sorted them in alphabetical order. What if we were to remove an item? Let's see what happens. Now we get an error, list index out of bounds. What's happening there is once we've removed it, the size of the list has gone down to 2. So we have item 0 and item 1, but item 2 no longer exists. And well, obviously we removed the first one, but just the fact that the list no longer contains 3 items, it only contains 2. So if you do a get on something that's larger than the list, you're going to get an error. So green and yellow. And that's what we expected because we removed item 0, which was red. Now, another way that we can access using the get colors.get is nice, but there's a more convenient way that we can access items in a list, and that is simply square brackets. And if you're familiar with other programming languages, this will look like, oops, let's get rid of those. This will look like indexing an array, and that's exactly what it is. There is a very tight relationship between arrays and lists in Apex programming. Same results. Another important aspect of lists and all the collections really is they are iterable. What that means is we can use them directly in for loops. If you're familiar with for loops in other programming languages, and even in Apex, your typical for loop is you're gonna start with an index, set it to 0, check for a condition, and increment it every time. If you haven't seen a for loop before, what we're doing is we're creating a variable called I, and we're checking to see, is I less than 3? If it is, we'll do this activity, and then at the end, we'll increment I so that we increase its value by 1. So first time through it's going to be 0, next time through 1, next time through 2, next time through it'll be 3, so it's no longer less than 3, so it's going to bail out. So it'll do similar to what we were doing previously, but now within a loop. A nice shortcut that lists provide us is we don't need all this setup and this indexing. We can simply say, since we know it's a string, we're going to do a string, and we'll call it color, and we use a colon instead of a semicolon, colors. So what this is saying is, for each item in the colors list, we're going to call it color, and just loop through each one. This string color will now have a value of, again, whatever was pushing through. And again, we're seeing the same result, but it's just a different way to get there. So as you can see, this structure here it's doing a lot behind the scenes. This is a nice shorthand way to access data in a list. It is such a common task to loop through a list and do something with the data that this construct appears in almost every computer language, any modern computer language. Very, very useful. When I look at for loops, this is probably what I see about 80% of the time is this style of for loop rather than the old indexing style, which if you've ever worked in C or C++, you might be more familiar with that. One other thing I want to point out is, and I mentioned earlier that lists and arrays are very related. We can actually do this as a shorthand, which if you're, again, looking at another language, this looks like we're making an array of strings, and here on this side we're doing a list of strings. But in Apex, they are the same thing. I could do exactly, execute this just like before, and we're going to get the same results. So that's a nice shorthand that the Apex programming language provides. Now, a real useful thing in Apex that's a little different than other languages is when we query the database, the Salesforce database, it returns things to us as a list. Let me show an example. If you're familiar with SOQL, which is the query language used in Salesforce, this should look familiar. If not, we will do a video on the details of this. I'm not going to dive into the explanation here, but the point is this is a way that we query. We're going to query IDs and names from contacts, and we're going to store it in a list, or again, it looks like an array, but it's really a list of contacts, and we're going to use the same looping pattern. We're going to grab each contact out of our contacts list, and we're going to debug, print out the name to the screen. And we can see we've got all those names. To me, this is a very powerful aspect of Apex. In many languages, when you query a database, you then have to put everything that you get through an object relation mapper or some code that gets it into a format that whatever your language, whether it's C#, C, Java, you need to do some translation to get it into your native language. And that is just something that's built into the Apex and the Salesforce platform. And that is one of the things I really, really like about this language, is we can just, we're not jumping through hoops to do a data query and get it into our language as objects. So that's all I've got for today for lists. I think we've gone long enough. Again, I wasn't going to go into every method call, but this should give you a good overview of lists and how to use them and how they're useful in Apex programming. If you have any questions on this, feel free to contact me. I read all the comments on these videos. That's a great way to get in touch. If you are new to Apex programming, or even if you're not, and you're curious about getting a little deeper dive, I've got a free mini course available. We'll have the link is in the description. And the free mini course is on Apex patterns and anti-patterns, where you can learn some best practices and some things to avoid when you're on your Apex programming journey. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you the next time. Bye-bye.